Welcome again to this workshop called Talking the Walk, Speaking Justice in the Language of Our Faith. Lindi Ramsden and I are both going to briefly introduce ourselves, and then Lindi has an opening reading to help us just take a breath together and get kind of centered down. I'm Kathleen McTigue. I am a Unitarian Universalist minister. I was ordained 28 years ago. I served our congregation in Winston-Salem, North Carolina for 4 years, and then in New Haven, Connecticut for 21 years. And I stepped into the role that I now hold 3 years ago as the first director of the Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice, which was founded 3 years ago when I was hired.
Are you going to use the mic?
I'm on the mic.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Is anybody having trouble hearing me?
Yeah, it's a little quiet.
Okay, is that better? Okay, so if you have trouble hearing me, please do raise your hand, and I will do my best to speak into it. If it doesn't work, I'll use one of the other mics. So I am the director of the Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice, which was founded 3 years ago at Justice GA in Phoenix. And the College of Social Justice is the creation of both the Unitarian Universalist Association and the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee in collaboration. And I'm going to let my friend and colleague Lindi introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. So Kathleen and I are kind of a similar vintage and social location. In terms of our ministry, we both started in seminary at Starking School for the Ministry when we were younger. So I've been in the ministry now for 30 years. I did an internship in Oakland, spent 17 years serving our congregation in San Jose, and spent 10 years as the executive director for the Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministry of California, now the UU Justice Ministry of California. Made a film about the human right to water, and then most recently have been serving as acting dean of students in community life and visiting assistant professor for faith and public policy at Starking School for the Ministry. I'm trying to get the longer title the longer I'm in ministry. So in each one of those opportunities to serve, I've had an interest in justice ministry, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to be able to come at it from different vantage points. So, and all of those vantage points require a deepening of faith to have this be something that comes from the center and not just from the head, and something that can be sustained over time. So I invite you to just settle in for a moment. I'd like to read you what feels to me like a prayer. And these are in the words of Ted Loder. Empower me to be a bold participant rather than a timid saint in waiting in the difficult ordinariness of now. To exercise the authority of honesty rather than defer to power or deceive to get it. To influence someone for justice rather than impress anyone for gain. And by grace, to find treasures of joy, of friendship, of peace hidden in the fields of the daily you give me to plow. Amen, and may it be so.
On behalf of the Unitarian Universalist tech folk who are sitting over against the wall here, I also want to let you know that for the first time ever, we are streaming some of the workshops from General Assembly live, in addition to General Session. And this is the very first one. So they were thrilled when they found out we had no PowerPoints or slides to work with for this very first experiment in live streaming. So there will be an opportunity not only for you, but for folks who may be joining us online to give us their thoughts and share some of their reflections as well. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of a framing for what it was that prompted Lindi and myself to want to offer this particular conversation here at General Assembly. I came into the ministry of Unitarian Universalism through what I think of as the door of social justice. I had been a social justice activist from the time I was a young college student. I kind of cut my teeth on the issue of divestment from South Africa in the 1970s. And after college, I moved into kind of a collective environment in the San Francisco Bay Area of radical political activists, all of us in our 20s, working on a variety of issues. But when I was in my mid-20s, I started really getting a serious spiritual hunger rising up along with my political activism, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And it was that spiritual hunger that drove me to seminary before I had any intention of or vision for the ministry. I went to seminary in order to explore that spiritual hunger. After 1 year, I dropped out of seminary at Starr King in order to follow a call that I felt to go live and work in Nicaragua with a group called Witness for Peace, which was working to end the Contra War in Nicaragua. And I lived and worked there in the war zones for 6 months. That completely changed my life because for the very first time, I was doing political work from a group whose base was faith-based. What that meant in practice was that we began each day with Bible study and with prayer, and I was not a Christian or a theist, so I viewed this askance. But it was done in the community of Nicaraguan peasants where we lived. So I was hearing deep expressions of faith from people who were the victims of that war, as well as the dictatorship that preceded it. I listened to people who prayed not only for clarity, but for the lives of their adversaries. And I watched the humility that rose up in the deep political conviction that rose to stand next to it because of the faith base. So when I came back to the United States and went back to seminary, I engaged my political work from a different place. I no longer found myself comfortable standing with those who were simply raising up signs and shouting slogans. I found myself, even though I was still very theologically confused, I found myself drawn to those who would kneel in silent prayer as part of their protest. There was something deeply appealing about that faith expression in the public sphere. The question about how we bring our faith expression into the public sphere is one that has framed my ministry all of these years. We don't all speak the same theological language. Even within one small collective of one small congregation, we don't all speak the same theological language. And yet, there is a certain instinct that I think we all have, that our Unitarian Universalist faith has some truth to speak, not just to us within the walls of our congregations, but out there where we take our stands in the public sphere. What I have observed, however, is that we do that, if we do it at all, haltingly and very imperfectly. And I've come to believe that that is largely a matter of not practicing it, not thinking much about what it might mean and how we might do it. Many of you have heard a phrase which can sound, or a sentence that can sound very self-satisfied, I think, but nevertheless we used to say it a lot, which is Unitarian Universalism is a place where you don't have to check your intellect at the door. How many of you have heard a version of that? Okay? And what we mean by that is you get to bring your whole self inside. You get to bring your brain along with your heart or your spiritual yearning. You don't have to suspend disbelief in order to participate in our congregations. But what I would submit is that we have in many ways become people who do check our spirituality at the door when we go back out. Can I hear an amen? Amen. Okay. So that's what this workshop is here to explore, is how can we stop doing that? How can we stop checking our spirituality at the door and instead bring it with us when we go out to take our stand for social justice? We have both been inspired by the most recent book that Paul Razor wrote, which is called Reclaiming Prophetic Witness, in which he makes a very strong plea for religious liberals, not just UUs, but religious liberals in general, to become better at bringing our religious voice, our religious language into the political sphere. And one of the things he wrote is this: it is important that we not allow our religious motivations to disappear into our cultural identity or our political preferences. If our religion plays a significant role in our lives, then it must do more than simply reinforce the values of our culture. In fact, our values are often deeply countercultural. Given the public dominance of conservative religious voices today, if religious liberals don't speak up, no one else will know that there is another religious perspective. Now, just in this past week, we have heard some very powerful expressions of religious perspective that I would call actually quite liberal, even though they did not come from our faith. The Pope's encyclical on climate change is an example of that. And so was the heartrending expressions of the people whose family members were slaughtered in Charleston, South Carolina, who spoke from the grounding of their faith when they addressed the terrorist who had taken their loved ones from them. So those are two examples of people speaking publicly from the grounding of their faith. So my question for exploration for us today is, how can we as Unitarian Universalists practice that same kind of authentic expression of our faith in the public sphere? Now, here is the exercise for you to engage in. Those of you who may have come in late, I warned people in advance that you're going to need something to write with and something to write on. So I invite you to pull those out, whatever they are. And when you're ready, I'm going to give you this little thought exercise, a situation into which I would like you to place yourself. Here is a place where you have to suspend disbelief. We're going to do a little make-believe. So bear with me. It will bear fruit, I promise. All right, so here's what I want you to imagine. You are taking a stand against climate change or for climate justice in your community, somewhere in your community. So take just a minute to think about a salient issue in your town, in your city. It could be a coal-fired plant you want to shut down. It could be an expansion of public transportation. It could be a legislative measure that's going to make sure that green building is what happens next in your city. Just give yourself a second to just come up with something so you know what the scenario is that you're placing yourself in. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. You have gone to the State House or to your city council to demand this thing. You are out doing a public witness, protest, demand, whatever you want to call it. And you're there with a gathering from your congregation. You're not there alone. There may be many others as well, but a whole crew from your congregation has gone there to make this demand or to go to this protest, all right? And I'm a CNN reporter, and I have just singled you out, and I've stuck a microphone in your face, and I've said, Richard, please tell me in one sentence what you're doing here. That's your exercise, okay? One sentence. This is going to be broadcast on national television, so be careful. Don't do that to yourself. Just give me one sentence of why you're here. Okay? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write this out. But remember, you're trying to articulate as clearly as you can why you are here at this protest. One sentence. All right. Now, I know it may not be a perfect sentence, but I want you to stop writing it, because I want to share a centering reading with you, and I want to encourage you to give your whole selves to this notion for a minute. I do workshops. I have in the last 3 years since I've been in this position done workshops at a variety of places around the country in which this context can expand to a 4-hour period of time. So there's much more opportunity to delve into these ideas. But one of the things I usually begin with is a show of, I ask people to just, in popcorn style, tell me what it means to practice our faith. What does it mean to be a practicing Unitarian Universalist? And invariably, the range of things that I hear are always about social action. They're about the different ways we live out our values in the world, because that's how we understand our faith, as an activist faith. But what we're concerned about, what Lindi and I are concerned about, is not just that we act, but how we act. And that our faith does not just tell us what to do, but how we do it, how we show up. So what I'd like to invite you to do, setting aside whatever sentence you just wrote for a moment, is to practice our faith in this moment by centering in it, by just centering down, getting calm and quiet, which I wish we did every time we go out in the public sphere, whether we call it praying together or not. Just to center down and quiet our minds. And listen to these words from Jean Lohman called Invocation. Let us try what it is to be true to gravity, to grace, to the given, faithful to our own voices, to lines making the map of our furrowed tongue, turned toward the root of a single word, refusing solemnity and slogans. Let us honor what hides and does not come easy to speech. The pebbles we hold in our mouths help us to practice song, and we sing to the sea. May the things of this world be preserved to us, their beautiful secret vocabularies. We are dreaming it over and new, the language of our tribe, music we hear and can only acknowledge. May the naming powers be granted. Our words are feathers that fly on our breath. Let them go in a holy direction. Now I'd like you to look at your sentence. And I'd like you to rewrite it. Unless you've already done it this way and you've leapt ahead of me, I'd like you to rewrite it so that I can recognize it's a statement of faith. It doesn't have to be speaking for our whole denomination. It needs to be authentic to your faith and your belief. But I want you to write it in such a way that that CNN person would know that you're here out of your faith conviction, taking this public stand. Okay, I'm going to ask you to come back to the gathered. Whoop. All right, folks. Hello. Thank you. Here are a few examples of the ways I've heard those sentences change. And I realize not all of them do. Sometimes people speak very fluently in a very grounded language of their faith. But quite often we start from a political, intellectual conviction, and it takes some real thinking to figure out how do we get it down more to a gut or a soul or a heart level. Here are a few examples of how sentences have changed. One woman's first sentence was, excuse me, climate change is real, and we must expand public transit to reduce the emissions that are causing so much damage. That was her first statement. Her second one was, as Unitarian Universalists, one of our core beliefs is that all life is connected. So it is a moral imperative that we shift our priorities to public transit that benefits all of us and the very life of our planet. Another one, a man who actually lives in a town where they're trying to shut down a coal-fired plant, said, I am here to protest the subsidies that enrich, oh no, that's the next one, sorry. This guy wrote, I'm here to protest the subsidies that enrich the oil and gas industries and to demand more investment in renewable energy. It's a perfectly adequate secular statement. And he changed it to say, I am here to bear witness to the unfairness that gives public money to oil and gas companies at the expense of the poor and the health of the planet, because my faith requires me to stand up against injustice. And the third one, this was the coal-fired plant. We want to shut down this coal-fired plant because it pollutes the community around it, whose members, mostly the poor, have suffered decades of health problems as a result. His second statement was, Unitarian Universalism teaches that all human beings are worthy of respect and equal treatment. So we demand that this coal plant be shut down so that our sisters and brothers in this neighborhood can breathe the clean air that is the birthright of all people. What do you hear as the difference? No, just put up your hand. What do you hear as the difference?
Faith, witness, faith calls me, faith requires me.
Faith? What's different in everybody sort of went ooh or yes, or what made the yes come up?
Passion connected to the fire of soul.
Passion connected to the fire of soul. Expression of our values.
It's applicable.
It's what?
Applicable.
Applicable.
You can see one specific thing that you can touch.
Okay, that it's specific. It's something you can grab hold of.
I think the secular statements sound a little argumentative, and you can hear somebody coming back with but. But when you speak from the core of your faith, people respect that, and they're less like.
Okay, hold on. I want you to say that again. Say that exactly the way you just said it.
The secular statements sound argumentative, like you're trying to prove your point to people. and they invite a rebuttal of the opposite. But when you speak from the core of your faith, people take a breath and can hear it easier. It doesn't sound argumentative.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone from the online community want to say anything? Has anybody chipped in? Oh, we can take a couple of them. Do you want a mic to say it? Okay, hang on. And it's just the question, not their sentences, but the question: what difference do you hear in these between the two kinds of sentences?
I think for me, what Ann Burns on the chat room says, which is making the language immediate and personal.
Okay, immediate and personal. Is there anyone else who's trying to say something online? No?
We have 3 comments total. So.
Okay. All right, a couple more. Anyone else want to say something? If you shout out, I'll repeat it. It might be faster than taking the mic around. Go ahead. Yes.
We need to be a voice for Unitarian Universalism in the public sphere.
That we need to be a voice for Unitarian Universalism in the public sphere. Who else had a hand up?
You stand in the authority of a long religious tradition rather than expressing just an opinion.
You stand in the authority of a long religious tradition rather than just expressing an opinion. So there's something about moral power that stands in there. Yes?
The second statement, to use the word Unitarian Universalist.
Why is that more powerful?
They identify us.
Okay, so the second sentences use the word Unitarian Universalist, so they identify us. Yes?
The faith words are explicit, they're not implied.
Okay, the faith words are explicit, they're not implied, is what she said. One more, and then I'm going to go on, so Lindi has her time.
The comment about speaking from the core of our faith, it struck me as being very parallel to what we learn about the power of I statements.
Okay, the statement that spoke of the core of our faith reminded him of the power of making what we're trained to do as I statements, speaking for yourself, not saying, well, people are saying that, but instead saying I feel or I think. So that's a more powerful statement. So what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about why I think this is so important, and then Lindi is going to come at this from a somewhat different angle. So my experience of us as Unitarian Universalists is that we do not practice enough speaking the language of our faith, not just out in the public sphere, but one-on-one with each other in our congregations. That there is something about our many decades of religious diversity and our welcoming of religious diversity that has, rather than enriching us as we claim it does, has in fact impoverished us because we've become very frightened of offending each other. So those of us who, we kind of have tended to speak a very bland language of our faith that doesn't say very much at all about our faith, because if I believe in God and you don't, I know that, and I don't want to say God because it might offend you. I've been in congregations where they can't use the word church because someone's going to get upset if you call the building a church. And what I would say to you is that unless we start becoming better at speaking one to one another in the language of our faith, we don't have any idea how to speak from the language of our faith outside our congregations. So in our congregations, we are very fond of saying that we tolerate diversity. We tolerate a huge realm of beliefs. But when I hear the word tolerate, I think of this. I tolerate your faith, right? So what I would submit to you is that living up to the promise of Unitarian Universalism does not require of us tolerance toward one another's beliefs. It requires of us glad curiosity. Glad curiosity is the practice of diversity. Glad curiosity is when I say, tell me more. When you say something from your faith perspective. It's when I say, well, that's not the language I use, but I can translate into the language that I use. Tell me more. That's glad curiosity. If we can't practice that with each other, how are we going to stand in the public sphere and ally ourselves with the black ministers of the NAACP when they take a stand for Black Lives Matter and they're praying in the name of Jesus Christ? Are we going to say, oh, I can't go to that demonstration? They don't speak my language. All right, translate. Translate. Receive them with glad curiosity. If we begin to practice the language of our faith with each other and can carry it out there into the public sphere, you will hear the same power you heard in those changed sentences, because it allows us to go deeper into that moral grounding that actually drives us. We are actually not driven by our intellectual commitments. We're driven from that deep place of feeling, of heartbreak, of anguish, and of hope. And those are the feelings that our faith can give voice to if we learn to practice it. There's one more thing that I think is incredibly important about us learning how to do this. It is that in the process of blanding down our language, many of us have removed ourselves from the interfaith circles that can be so incredibly powerful in moving our country and our world toward desperately needed social change. We've kind of stood up against the side of the wall instead of sitting around the interfaith table. When it's our turn to pray, I've actually heard Unitarian Universalists say, oh no, Unitarian Universalists don't pray. Instead of stepping forward and speaking our faith in that public sphere, taking our seat around the table. The world needs us. It needs our faith, and it needs our voices spoken from that faith. Lindi. I could say more.
I think I'm going to do it from here. Well, first off, thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. She's amazing. I always feel inspired by her. So where I wanted to go with this, I'm remembering the phrase that Dick Gilbert lifts up a lot that apparently originally came from James Luther Adams, that Unitarian Universalism at its best has a spiritual center and a civic circumference. And that image of that circle has always really helped to guide me. And I think as we try to bring our justice commitments and our civic circumference into deeper dialogue with our spiritual lives, it's not only learning how to speak that language in public settings and within our own congregations. It's not only that we need a prophetic moral voice. I've been thinking also about the power of a pastoral presence as a core part of the spiritual center that connects with our justice ministries. So not only a prophetic voice, but the power of a pastoral presence. Because justice ministry is not just about all the various goals we're trying to reach, critical and important as they are. It also has to do with how we do the work. What kind of people are we as we engage in this process? For ourselves, in our social justice teams, in our congregations, and in the larger community. Paul Razor, who Kathleen mentioned at the first part of this presentation, has a passage that I thought was pretty pointed. He says, if we name a theology of love, but treat people with disrespect, if we name a theology of interdependence, but insist on our own independence, if we name a theology of inclusion, but need to make all the important decisions, we are out of sync. I could see myself in that challenge. I have seen in my work with the UU Legislative Ministry, where I had an opportunity to visit congregations all over the state and see patterns repeated in social justice teams that can get tiny and grumpy with each other. And tiny and grumpy is not something that really attracts people in and builds power. So I thought at this point in our workshop together, part of my spiritual practice is singing. And I thought it would be good to sing the text to 1 Corinthians 13, though I may speak with bravest fire. It's often used in weddings. But I invite you to sing the song together, to think of your location as someone working on justice ministry in your own life and in your congregation. And as Kathleen said, we had no idea this many people would come. We brought like a few handouts with the words on them. And they're mostly in the front seats, and we're asking you to share them with each other. And those of you in the back, Kathleen's going to flip the pages here. Right? But hopefully not the mic. All right? So could you, those of you who are willing and able to please rise. All right, so how about we try this note as our starting note? Though I may speak with bravest fire and have the gift to all inspire, but have not love, my words are vain as sounding brass and hopeless gain. Though I may give all I possess, though I may give all I possess, and striving so, my love profess, but not be given, my love within, the prophet soon turns strangely sin. Come, Spirit, come, Spirit, come, our hearts control, our spirit longs to be made whole. Let inward love guide every deed. By this we worship, and are free. Thank you.
Could you grab the mic there so I don't tip it over? Thank you.
Yeah, we're the low-tech crew here. We're the low-tech generation. So I want to read that passage from Paul Reiser again. If we name a theology of love but treat people with disrespect, if we name a theology of interdependence but insist on our own independence, if we name a theology of inclusion but need to make all the important decisions, we are out of sync.
How do you spell his name, please?
Paul Reiser, R-A-S-O-R. The name of the book is Reclaiming Prophetic Witness. Reclaiming Prophetic Witness. He's got a couple of good books. Oh, okay. So Unitarian Universalism has been emphasizing deeds over creeds for a long period of time. What we believe and the values we hold are demonstrated, however, not only by what we say, but actually how we conduct ourselves. Now, I was really happy this morning to wake up and see that the Supreme Court has allowed the Affordable Care Act to stand. Yeah. And I wanted to share a brief story about when we were working in California to help advance healthcare reform. And within Unitarian Universalism and within the community of people that were trying to advance healthcare reform, there were passionate disagreements. Passionate disagreements, not necessarily about wanting health for everyone, but how to get there. Was it single payer the only route? Or was it possible to do some kind of incremental process to get there? Those who were in the single payer camp were not at all happy with those who were working on incremental. And some of the folks that had been working on incremental were people that had put forth a ballot measure in California to have single payer many years earlier and gotten like 26 or 27%. They were operating from their frame of reference, others were operating from theirs. And one of the things that was really troubling was that there was so much internal discord that it was starting to affect the capacity to actually move anything. And so I was pleased that Unitarian Universalists, through the legislative ministry, as people who have seen many different paths towards the holy, could hold the space for people to come together out of those leadership teams and get to know one another and talk to one another and give one another permission to go ahead and passionately pursue what they felt was right, but to do it in a language and in a style that was not tearing down the other. Now that to me was an example of bringing the values of our faith into the public sphere, in part because we had built relationships of trust, of kindness, and of respect with a variety of leaders in the community. Now, after 30 years or so of ministry, I've seen some really wonderful blessings in ways that people have worked together, and I've seen some really challenging and stressful experiences. William Ellery Channing in 1838, in his address on self-culture, lifted up the concept of actually cultivating our virtues and improving our character as individuals as a path that was central to religious life and expression. Many are familiar with Gandhi's phrase about being the change we want to see. And I've started to think about what would it look like to be more intentional and articulate about our personal character and the virtues that we're trying to embody, as well as the organizational cultures we're trying to create in our social justice teams, in our congregations, in our coalitions. Because our lives do speak more loudly than our words, and when we operate at a kind of intensity and urgency around a given justice initiative that can end up disregarding other people's humanity, we may have a short-term win, but in the long term, we've depleted the soil of relationships from which we can grow this tree of justice. One of my favorite UU bloggers, Tom Shade, in the Living Tradition, he made a comment about going into an Obama headquarters campaign back in 2008, and he said, there's a simple sign on the wall, and it had 3 words. It said, respect, include, empower. And the piece that he wrote about respect, I thought was particularly interesting. He said, we should respect the desire expressed by any person for social transformation. We should respect them for having it. We should respect the reasons they have for it. We should stop judging its sophistication. We should not disrespect it, laugh at its naivete, dismiss it as white guilt or hypocrisy or being faddish or inappropriate to their experience. We should meet them where they are. And I've thought about the dynamic that can happen in the social justice arena that leads us towards a path of really lack of kindness and respect towards one another. And I compare this to maybe the process of our music programs. No one is upset with someone who is learning to play an instrument. You're excited to bring someone into the fold of music. And when they're at the beginning, you have someone who is a coach, a teacher, a mentor, a connector. So as we think about being people who've been very active and deep and committed our lives to social justice and social justice ministry, let us be mindful not only to respect those who have incredible capacity and talent and insight to bring to the table, but those who are brand new and who are stumbling and who are saying things that are completely, quote unquote, inappropriate. How do we both respect those and look to those who have gifts to offer while allowing people to come in the door and get started? So I started to think about, we've got principles, we've got our purposes and our principles, and most of our principles are fairly public faith kinds of statements: equity, justice, interdependence, democracy. We have one that talks about respect for one another's spiritual growth and encouragement. But I started thinking, maybe we should start talking about developing at least a few actually explicit virtues that we want to cultivate. And the language of cultivation really does come out of Channing, out of the Transcendentalists, that sense that there is a seed of goodness in each of us that we can cultivate. And so I started thinking about, well, what might those virtues be? There was an article in the New York Times a while back where some folks who research on virtues, they came up with 24. I thought, yeah, that's a long list. And then I also thought about how much the virtues I might pick for myself or my faith community come from the perspective of my own social location, my age, my gender, sexual orientation, class, race, the whole works. And so I think that as we think about what are the most important virtues that we might want to cultivate, we need to be hearing what's out there and noticing what's coming up for us. So I want to give you an opportunity to take just 1 minute on your little piece of paper. And if you thought about what would be the virtues that would make us better people, better as teams, more empowered, more sustainable, what would that be? What would you need to practice? So just write that down. And then I'll tell you my list. Sure. She asked if I'd say it one more time. Write on your piece of paper a few of the virtues that you think would be most important to cultivate for yourself as a Unitarian Universalist and for your community with which you are working. One way to get at that is, I would like to be more, So the ones that I came up with, and I would also mention that Tom Shade is also writing about virtues, and he has a list as well that I encourage you to check out his blog at The Living Tradition. Tom Shade, S-C-H-A-D-E. So the ones I came up with are, number one, I'd like to be loving. And when I looked at the 1 Corinthians 13, the next part of the passage that has to do with love is patient and kind, does not boast, does not dishonor others, is not self-seeking, is not easily angered, keeps no record of wrongs, does not delight in evil, rejoices in truth. That's a high bar. And when you're in the midst of social justice dynamics with passionate, powerful impulses to get stuff done and having an oppositional culture in which this whole thing unfolds, it is so easy to start just demonizing opponents and making it us versus them. So for me, when I think about virtues, I want to figure out how to be more loving, not only in the larger public sphere, but within the group of people that I am working. The second one I had on, excuse me, the second one I had on my list that feels like very deeply true to Unitarian Universalism is to be open. To be open, in my mind, also involves deep humility, because being open means that revelation is not sealed. You are not the final word. What you're thinking about is not the final word. Someone else might actually have an idea. And if you are working in a culture or community that is not your own, being open and humble in that environment to listen deeply is critical. Same within your own community where you think you already know what everybody's going to say around the circle of your social justice team. You don't know what other experiences people have had. So being open and humble to new ideas, to newcomers. There's that story of the fellow who went to the master teacher and asked him, what was the wisdom he wanted to share about life. And the master teacher just kept filling his teacup over and over and over until it was all spilling all over. And he's like, could you just stop pouring tea in my cup? And he said, basically, you have to empty yourself before you're ready to receive. So how do we bring that capacity into social justice? The third one on my list was hopeful. Nobody's attracted to social justice ministries that are totally depressed. Hope is not just a feeling, it's a virtue. Cultivate it. My fourth one was balanced, that we have action and reflection, that we have work and play, that we step up and step back. Times to lead, times to follow. My fifth one was that I would like to be grateful. I would like to be grateful for what is, even in its brokenness, that I have the opportunity to be here and do this work with everyone. I would like to be grateful for the newcomer and grateful for the person that has tremendous talent. Again, think about your social justice team kind of like your choir. If you've got somebody that sings in the local symphony chorus, they might not necessarily be at choir practice every Wednesday, but they have amazing gifts to offer to you. You have similar dynamics in your social justice arena in your congregation. And lastly, I would like to be in solidarity, which also requires humility. Doing this is not a solo piece of work. Audre Lorde has that phrase about you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. And Alicia Ford recently, in her keynote address to the Pacific School of Religion, said, going it alone is kind of a strategy from the master's house. We don't have the luxury to just be independent actors. We have to be in solidarity. So mine are loving. I want to be loving. I want to be open and humble. I want to be hopeful. I want to be balanced. I want to be grateful, and I want to be in solidarity. And I want to do this with y'all. So you might have your own list, like one of the virtues that's on my radar screen, but I already have probably too much of it, which is persevering. My family could speak to this. So you may have your own set of things that you want to grow into. But I think it would be fascinating to have a conversation as Unitarian Universalists to start to lift up qualities, because we have such powerful principles, but we end up shooting ourselves in the foot by not behaving in ways that invite people to join us and that bring out our best selves. In closing, I want to use an example that I heard from a congregation in California. They were leading up to taking a vote on opposing the first Iraq War. And, at that time we didn't know as much as we know now, and there were lots of different opinions. And the congregation had a team that had been doing lots of one-on-one relational building and knew itself. And they went out and they talked to all the people in a one-on-one capacity that they thought might not feel comfortable with this position that their social justice team was going to be bringing forward. They took their input, they took that conversation, and they brought a resolution back to the congregation, which passed. Not unanimously, but pretty close. And as the story goes, the following day on a Sunday, or the following Sunday, the worship associate was one of the people who had voted against it. And this person got up, and kind of wondering, well, I wonder what he's going to say. He got up and he said, I just want to say that while I don't agree with the vote that we took, I do agree that the church needs to have a moral voice. And I know that you cared about what I thought, that you listened to me, and you love me, and I love you too. Now that is amazing justice ministry. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So we want also to hear from you a little bit, but before we do that, the last piece I want to put on this presentation from us, can you all hear me? Because I just put this back on. So is this thought for you. And I'm speaking my truth here, so you may disagree with it, and that's just fine. But I just ask you to consider it. So as the director of the College of Social Justice, what I was charged to do, what the college has been charged to do, is to create a variety of justice programs around experiential learning that will support and sustain and inspire justice work when people come back from these programs. When I was asked to step into this role, one of the things that I was told was, we want these programs to be faith-based. And I said, well, what do you mean by faith-based? And the answer I got was completely heady. It was, well, we want people to know about our long history of social justice and Unitarian Universalism and some of the theological grounding for why we take justice stands and so forth. And I said, well, if you hired me to be the director here, what I would say it means to me is that our programs would be created with an expectation of contemplative practice as a part of what it means to practice our faith. And I went on to talk a little bit about that. But what I'm raising here is the idea that if we are serious about wanting to cultivate in ourselves some virtues, and if we are serious about needing to go deep into our own hearts in order to know the religious and spiritual truth we wish to speak in the public sphere, we must find some ways to practice our faith that help us get quiet up here, at least from time to time, that just shut the chatter down a little bit so we can listen at another level and be open at another level. Spiritual practices in their wild variety of forms help us to do that. They are intentional. They're something we do with intention. They are attentional. They help us pay attention. And they are repeated so that they become a habit. They get built into our lives. So I encourage you to consider that idea, if you don't already have some kind of spiritual practice, to find out where that still small voice is coming from in you so that you can manifest it in your life and in your congregation. We have about 15 minutes, and we are curious to hear from you, your thoughts and responses. And I would invite you to either come up to the mic or to utilize one of these handheld mics, and we can start them on both sides. Obviously, Lindi, if you'll just walk with that one. If you'll put up your hand, we will come to you with a microphone. And I also want to be sure that we get an opportunity for anyone who is listening online to speak.
Well, I work in an interfaith group.
Talk right into it.
Okay, I work in an interfaith group, and I admit that I'm reluctant sometimes to talk as a Unitarian Universalist. But what was really embarrassing to me was a minister who's in that group. I don't remember what kind of a program we were planning, but he was going to give the opening prayer. And he said, well, I suppose I shouldn't mention God, Barb. And I said, no, that's not true. But that kind of misunderstanding is out there. And I am so inspired by the people who I'm working with who are inspired by the gospel.
Thank you.
I'm Claire Barker from the Theodore Parker Church in West Roxbury, and our congregation gets hung up on when are we speaking in the name of the church and when are we speaking as individuals. So I'm here to talk to people who share that problem and try to understand how we work that through. Thanks.
Well, let's see. I don't think that we're going to be able to answer questions like that so much, but I think elevating them now is a really important thing to do, because I know lots of people in congregations do wrestle with this. Do you want to say one sentence here? Yeah.
Our board has developed a little form, for lack of a better word. If our social justice committee or our green team wants to speak in the name of the congregation or anyone else in a public sphere, we write down the justifications, we put it out there, and the board takes a look and they go, you know what, that sounds good. Now, I know that doesn't bring in the whole congregation. It's not like taking a vote to stand against a war. But anyway, that's what we're doing now, and it seems to be working.
Thank you. You might just note where each other are, so you could continue this conversation.
I think I'm next.
More fully.
I'm Drew Betts. I'm from Bellingham,
Where
Washington. I'm part of the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship, which is really a church, a very large one, that's getting an award tomorrow, or 2 days from now, the Bennett Award for Social Justice, and also has been instrumental in organizing the witness event. So we do a lot of stuff in our church. But one of the things that that as the worship co-chair, I find that there's still pushback on bringing social justice witness into worship setting, and I think that that is one of the challenges that we all continue to have. That people say, "I came for sanctuary, I came to be nurtured," and raising the prophetic voice, even in a worship setting, is something that is a challenge. So I just wanted to read you my list that Lindsay, a couple of the things. To practice forgiveness, compassion, and gratitude. We had some similars. To acknowledge our privilege, that we have privilege, we stand in privilege, we meet in privilege, and to find ways to move beyond that in meaningful ways. To believe in our own voice and to be unapologetic about our faith.
Okay, hold on. I was just checking to see if there were any online responses. There don't seem to be so far. So did you have your hand up? Here.
Thank you. I'm Michael Greenman from Columbus, Ohio. First Unitarian Universalist Church will be the hosts next year in Columbus at the GA.
Right.
And I'm also the moderator of a national organization of Move to Amend called the Interfaith Caucus. And our purpose is to bring together communities of faith to address primarily climate change, because all are concerned as stewards of creation. However, what you've done for me today is to point out that as a Unitarian Universalist, I have been talking from a completely climate situation, corporate power, and not using my UU values and principles, although I refer to them.
Right.
And I thank you so much for that.
That's great.
We'll be able to change our way of addressing this.
Good. Great. Is there someone else?
I'm back here. My name is Ken Temmin Seleska. I'm a minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Wayzata, Minnesota. And it's sort of a parallel piece that we don't have rituals around admitting our mistakes and forgiveness, essentially confession. There's a lot of other denominations that have that. And in our justice work, we make a lot of mistakes, especially, I think, sometimes in racial issues. We're afraid to speak up because we might say the wrong thing, and we do say the wrong thing sometimes. And so I don't have really a question or a solution necessarily, but I've been wrestling with this for years on how to, some sort of a public process, a public ritual, where we say we did something wrong. And then there is forgiveness and grace, and those are some of my virtues that I'm interested in, is humility, forgiveness, and grace. because we do make mistakes in this all the time. And to find a way to say, we understand, and what you did was not okay, but you're still part of our community, and we're still going to move forward together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's crucial if we're going to be part of that public conversation with interfaith groups that are familiar with grace and forgiveness.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay. Go ahead. And then
Lifelong UU.
Talk right into the mic. Go ahead.
Lifelong UU here. Very grounded in what we don't believe and flying under the radar in the Bible Belt and just not being a UU out there. I'm still working on my one sentence. It's difficult, and I'm very happy to be working on it.
Good.
Great. Wonderful.
I'm Tom Atterbury from Pocatello, Idaho, and it sometimes feels in our congregation as if we can't speak with one voice because we don't necessarily have the same faith. We have different beliefs. So, talking about social issues as a matter of faith sometimes feels like we're trying to square a circle, and that still feels, although it was a great talk, it still feels a bit unresolved to me.
To give an answer to what you were talking about, in our church, and maybe in your church too, we do candles of joys and concerns. And there might be something in there where you could build that kind of confessional and forgiveness. It may need to happen someplace else, because as we all know, in the Catholic Church, you do that on your own, in private, in a box, and the only person that knows is the priest. Who usually knows your name, but there may be something in there that we can use in our own traditions.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm probably a little bit of a peculiarity because I'm a rabbi and a member of Troop Unitarian Universalist Church in Pasadena, and I look at this a little bit from a different lens. As someone who organizes in the faith community, I do worker justice work in Los Angeles, organizing faith leaders of all types and stripes and varieties. And I think it's interesting that when we asked to give two different elevator pitches as to why be involved in climate change work, while it was not explicit, there was a clear sense of connection to UU principles. All of the 7 principles that you hold and cherish, some of you cherish more than others. It is one of the best things from an interfaith perspective that the Unitarian Universalists have done to create a vision for this work. And so those principles, I think, really do ground you in this work. And you should never forget that people are trying to figure you out. Just as you are in a room with folks that you may not see exactly what the connection is, that's an important thing. So the more you can speak to the spirit of a collective vision, the better for everybody, because it helps amplify your voices. And the rest of us, those who are not Unitarian Universalists, do need you to help build movement and to model that healthy dialectic between independence and interdependence. And I'm delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. We probably have time for 2 more. One is here, and then maybe one in the back.
My name is Mariah Converse. I work for All Souls in New York, and I grew up UU. And for some of us but All Souls in New York is a church that is a lot of people who did not grow up UU. And I've begun taking a leadership role in the Black Lives Matter conversation at All Souls, and our DRE has really empowered us to focus around covenant, and that some people who are newer to UUism may not understand what that represents for some of the rest of us. And so we read the covenant of the multicultural ministries at the beginning of every meeting, and we read it slowly. We try to think carefully about it. We leave lots of space for conversation about it. And in a recent meeting, it's all we talked about for 2 hours. And it was the most powerful conversation around race that I've been a part of at All Souls. And so I think holding that idea of covenant and our relationships to each other and to the rest of the world are a great way of grounding our faith.
Thank you. Is there one back there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
And then we have one from the online crew as well.
Okay. I'm Karen Schaefer from the UU in Idaho Falls, and we're quite remote, except for Pocatello, here an hour away. And I'm thinking about the United Nations office. I'm a rep with that, and communicating in the third world, and they use the radio a lot. Do we UUs have any radio programs? And I'm thinking we could have one on our 7 principles. My son went in college to a UU-UNO meeting and got inspired at the University of Chicago and started a radio show that was like at 2 in the morning and brought in the Indian nations to speak on Thanksgiving Day and had other groups that came in that region, and I guess it's still going. And he's not actually a UU member now, but I'm thinking maybe where I live, the Mormons have such a great radio show and presence, and I drive a lot, and you see a lot of committed Christians, and maybe we could have fun doing that. We could each congregation do a show and submit it based on the 7 principles and how we take our social action to heart.
Thank you. Thank you. Just before we hear from the person online, someone has just pointed out to me this book that both Lindi and I cited, Paul Razor's book, Reclaiming Prophetic Witness. He's going to be at the bookstore today, at the UUA bookstore booth at 4:30, signing copies of that book, which is available in paperback, so it's not terribly expensive. So I highly recommend it. It was the common read this past year. So please stop by the booth if you can. That's at 4:30. One more comment from our online crew.
Jack Wool.
Talk right into it.
Jack Wool, who's online, says, we have to be comfortable that our principles are our faith or expressions of our faith. This is either or both our faith in our community and our faith in spirit.
Great, thank you. It is now noon, so we're to end now. I have a benediction, though, if you all would just mind staying for one more minute. It is another sample of ways that we can center and ground ourselves. Yeah, I invite you to stand and take hands as you listen to these words. May we turn heart and mind to the needs of a small and struggling planet. May we listen well to the call that is ours to hear, put our hands to the work that is ours to do, and let our spirits flourish in the blessing of a life worth its living. Go in peace into the rest of this beautiful day. Thank you.